valley there grows sweet union. Let us arise and drink our fill in yonder's valley there grows sweet union. Let us arise and drink our fill. The winter's past and the spring appeareth. The turtle dove is in our land. In yonder's valley there grows sweet union. Let us arise and drink our fill. The winter's past and the spring appeareth. The turtle dove is in our land. In yonder's valley there grows sweet union. Let us arise and drink our fill.
In wisdom's lovely pleasant ways, I'll spend my days, I'll spend my days.
In wisdom's lovely pleasant ways, I'll spend my days, I'll spend my days. I'll learn to watch, to pray and praise, and thus I'll learn your wisdom's ways. I'll learn to watch, to pray and praise, and thus I'll learn your wisdom's ways. In wisdom's lovely pleasant ways, I'll spend my days, I'll spend my days. In wisdom's lovely pleasant ways, I'll spend my days, I'll spend my days. I'll learn to watch, to pray and praise, and thus I'll learn your wisdom's ways. I'll learn to watch, to pray and praise, and thus I'll learn your wisdom's ways. Yielding and simple may I be, like a pliant willow tree, humble in heart, pure and free, pride and bondage spurning. Yielding and simple may I be, like a pliant willow tree, humble in heart, pure and free, pride and bondage spurning. Heavenly zephyrs around me blow, bend and sway me to and fro, cause my soul in truth to grow, and from wrong be turning. Heavenly zephyrs around me blow, bend and sway me to and fro, cause my soul in truth to grow, and from wrong be turning.
Good evening. Hello. Just get out of my PowerPoint here. Pardon me. Okay. Good evening. Welcome. My name is Anna Gunther. I am the events coordinator here at the museum, the Enfield Shaker Museum. We are excited to host you and Dr. Lourdes Aviles tonight as part of our ongoing Weatherwise programming sponsored by New Hampshire Humanities. As I welcome you to this digital event, I'm happy to announce that we will have a book prize of Dr. Aviles' book, Taken by Storm, for someone who is attending tonight after the Q&A session. I'd also like to start just preemptively by thanking our director, Shirley, our curator, Michael, and longtime volunteer and friend of the museum, Galen Beal, all of whom contributed to my introduction tonight. Galen did so unknowingly through an article she wrote almost 20 years ago about the Enfield Shaker Bridge exhibit in 2002, which I will come back to shortly. In this lecture series, we are exploring how Americans historically documented the weather as part of a larger community project to create an exhibit on shakers and the weather. Many Shakers, like many Americans, noted a day's weather in their diaries, each diary entry beginning with a few words such as sunny, gray, rain in the afternoon. These personal journals helped their authors recall past weather as a reason for doing or not doing certain tasks. Over time, personal journals like almanacs provided patterns from which to predict weather. No one could really predict the Great New England Hurricane of 1938. It was the most devastating tropical cyclone of all time to affect this region. Only 2 other comparable storms have been documented before or since. As tonight's presentation will teach us, among other things, weather forecasting was not then the science it is today. In the context of today's 24-hour news cycle, weather coverage, and the tiny computer that you keep in your pocket that can give you weather all around the globe at any moment. In that context, that modern context, it can be difficult to grasp the enormity of the size and the extent and the impact of the 1938 hurricane. Meteorological science can quantify the energy of the storm, but assessing the human impact stretches our modern imaginations. Tens of thousands of homes destroyed or damaged, salt spray on windows in Montpelier, Vermont, and a storm so strong that it reached inland with enough power to still be a Category 1 as it entered Vermont. Weather memory, different than weather science, requires no specialized skills. New Englanders took up their pens and cameras to document the hurricane's devastation. They wrote songs and poems and works of fiction. They surveyed damage, made souvenirs and scrapbooks. Today, this evidence tells us much about the way humans cope with natural disaster, from surviving calamity to remembering it. Museum exhibits focused on well-known landmarks are too a kind of memory. In 2002, and I have learned since also in 2012, the museum has had different Shaker Bridge exhibits. Hopefully you saw some of the introductory slides of the Shaker Bridge, or perhaps you are an Enfield local who drives over this bridge daily. The original bridge, first completed in 1841, was a unique and unusual construction that became a small tourist attraction. Described as closer to a causeway than a bridge, the bridge required frequent repair due to the nature of its construction and would sway side to side and also rose and fell with the lake water. In the 2002 newsletter article I referenced earlier, Galen explains that, quote, many early travelers were afraid of crossing the Shaker Bridge because of its roller coaster effect combined with its zigzag motion. Further adding to the drama of a trip over the Shaker Bridge was the thunder-like rumbling that emanated from the bridge's planked surface. Despite needing repairs, this bridge held until 1938. And thanks to the Enfield Historical Society and Margaret Seaman's 2011 college project, we have a riveting first-person account of Ernest Walter Parker, born in 1920 and allegedly the last person to drive over the Shaker Bridge before it was flooded in the rains in 1938. He was 17 at the time, and I'm going to read a very short excerpt from that. On Saturday, September 18th at 7 o'clock in the evening, he left his parents' house in his 1929 Model A Roadster. It had been raining all day. The wind was blowing when I left Enfield Center, but I didn't think much of it. It was just the wind. I had no idea what was coming. There were no TVs in that days, and only one house in 10 or 15 had a radio. 90% of the radios were battery powered, and you only turned them on when you wanted to hear a special program to save your battery. They did not have regularly scheduled weather broadcasts like they do today because they couldn't predict weather like they do now. When I left Enfield at 8:30 p.m., the wind was really howling. I couldn't get to Shaker Bridge because a limb was down across the road, so I went back to town and bought a pulp saw and axe. I removed the limb out of the way, and when I got to Shaker Bridge, Daniel Ivey, the road agent at the time, was setting up a barricade so cars couldn't go across. I walked partway across the bridge and told Ivey I could make it. He refused to ride with me. He had to get to the other side, but he walked. I couldn't see where I was going. The wind was driving the rain straight through the car. Roadsters didn't have windows, and the headlights, just a bulb behind glass, were useless. The other end of the bridge had started to wash out, so I bounced through a wide hole about 2 feet deep and made it to the other side. Ivy made it across several minutes later. He told me he had to keep stopping to grab the rail or be blown into the lake. He said that a section that had been there when I drove across it had washed away before he got there. There was just half the width of a vehicle left. I later found out that the wind was averaging 100 miles an hour, gusting up to 120 miles an hour. The waves in the lake were 5 feet or better. The account goes on to describe a 5-hour trip going less than 4 miles. He does get home, but after many roadblocks and a ruddy detour through the La Salette fields, it's a fascinating, quick read, 5 pages. And my coworker, Catherine, is going to drop a link to that on our website if you are interested in reading it in full. I don't think you'll regret it. It's really great. So with that first-person account of an Enfield resident experiencing the 1938 hurricane firsthand, I'm thrilled to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Lourdes Aviles, a trustee of the University Corporation for Atmospheric Research, teaches at Plymouth State University. Her areas of expertise include historical, physical, dynamical, and tropical meteorology, as well as air quality, interdisciplinary connections of meteorological phenomena, and public communication about severe weather science and safety. She was the 2020 recipient of the Plymouth State University Faculty Excellence in Service Award. Dr. Aviles currently conducts research on historical meteorology. Her book, Taken by Storm, 1938, A Social and Meteorological History of the Great New England Hurricane, earned the 2014 History Choice Award of the Atmospheric Science Librarians International. Dr. Aviles is currently working on a book, on the science and history of atmospheric origins. We would also at the museum like to congratulate Dr. Aviles on her recent appointment as the chair of the brand new climate studies program at Plymouth State. And that is it from me. Lourdes, if you are ready to take over, I welcome you to our stage.
All right. So good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. It is my absolute pleasure to be here. And let me share my slides so that I can tell you all about the Great New England Hurricane. So as Anna said, I am a professor of meteorology at Plymouth State University, and I gave this a new title, What's Left Behind, the Science, History, and Remnants of the New England Hurricane of 1938. I have given many versions of this talk. This one is special for the Enfield Museum. Before I go on, I just want to say a little bit about New England hurricanes. There are many remnants of hurricanes that we experience every year, anything from some storminess and rain, just remnants of old hurricanes. Once in a decade or so, we do get hit by an actual hurricane. The last one would have been Irene. And once every 3 or so decades, we get a major hurricane like Hurricane Carol in southern New England, for example. But then there are the three big ones, the ones that make landfall as a major hurricane and also cause widespread devastation, not just where they made landfall, but everywhere in the region. And as Anna said, there have only been three of those. And the shakers would have been there for the 1815, the Great Gale of 1815, but we don't have as much information about that one. In 1938, the building was there, but the shakers were not anymore. And as Anna said, this is when the bridge was destroyed. So a lot of what was experienced during this storm in 1938 would have also been experienced before. The one in 1635 during colonial times, same story, different life, because that would have been toward the beginning of the colonization of the region. So the 1938 hurricane is the one to which all other New England hurricanes are sooner or later compared. And it was the topic of my research for more than 10 years. What I like to do is not just study the meteorological aspects of the storm, the science of the storm, but also the connections with other science like hydrology, forest ecology, geology, and things like that, but also connections with society, with the financial effects, the emergency management aspects, also the historical times in which the hurricane happened, and the history of our knowledge about hurricanes. So all that I like to study. And for this project, I reviewed probably hundreds of documents, technical documents, letters, reports of all kinds. And eventually I put it all in a book, which is the book that you guys are raffling tonight. So I want to give you a little bit of the history of the storm and the science of the storm. I want to use the timeline of the storm to talk to you about different aspects of this science or historical events that were happening at the moment. And I will also show you some of the things that I have come across while researching the hurricane, some throughout the timeline of the hurricane, but also some others toward the end. The first thing is this map from September 21st, 1938. Since 1871, the Weather Bureau, which is what today is the National Weather Service, has put together one of these maps, one per day, summarizing the weather for that day. And this is the map for the day of the hurricane. You can see the hurricane marked here. You can see a large area of rain, the area affected. There's all sorts of weather observations that were reported by observers. There's forecast information, a lot of information in these maps. So that day was a Wednesday. People were going about their business. It had been very rainy. But for once, they woke up to some places to some sunlight. Others, it was still cloudy, but no rain. So people took advantage to do errands, go to the beach, have a picnic. This is New England, so we had a lot of summer dwellers, but most of them were gone, back home, back to school. And everybody was preoccupied with the political situation in Europe. If we had 24-hour news channels, they would have been talking about it. It was still almost exactly a year to the beginning of World War II, but the political events that led to it were already happening. So people were very preoccupied by it. Little did they know that before the end of the day, hundreds would be dead, and they would experience the costliest storm that had ever been experienced anywhere in the US and probably in the world by the time. Since then, we have had costliest storms, but if we convert it to $20, it would have been $5 to $10 billion of damage. And if a storm like that happened today, it would easily be $100 to several hundred billions of dollars in damage. Nearly 700 people died. The numbers are a little iffy. We don't know exactly, but that's the official number of deaths. There was just widespread devastation everywhere, buildings, infrastructure, roads. This is a once in a century New England storm. Those three big ones that we've had, on average, they tend to happen once every 150 years. So if we go all the way back to when the storm formed, I will give you a little tour through the storm's history. It all started over Africa, the southern part of the Sahara Desert. There was some disturbed weather that was detected at the beginning of September. Then that moved toward the Atlantic and immediately developed a rotation. And we didn't have satellites, of course, so this is what it would have looked like. Here's Hurricane Bill in 2009. This is similar to what would have been seen if we had satellites. We started our satellite coverage for hurricanes started in 1960, and it was not until 1980 that we have full global coverage. So most of the knowledge about the storm happened afterward, when we went back and evaluated the observations. The first observation occurred almost 2 weeks later on September 16. It was done by a Brazilian cargo ship, the SS Alegrete, which itself had a very dramatic history of its own. It was sized during World War I, and it was sunk by friendly fire during World War II. But anyway, they were the ones that first recorded a storm and provided those observations. And it's actually pretty interesting to see how much information can be gotten from those ship observations. They can get the strength, the position, the direction of movement. And that's an image from the book. I was able to figure out where the storm was where the ship was respect to the storm, likely passing through the northern part of the eye. These are huge cargo ships, so they are able to withstand it. But the problem with ship observations is that once it becomes known that there's a hurricane and ships start radioing their observations, then all the other ships try to stay out of there. So the more information the ships provide at first, the less information there is available later, because understandably, the ships get out of the way of the hurricane. So when we didn't have the National Hurricane Center back in 1938, that was created in 1955, what they did is that there were different Weather Bureau offices in charge depending on where the hurricane was. So when we first learned of the hurricane, the office in charge was Jacksonville, Florida, and they were the ones that kept an eye on the observations and sent out warnings and things like that. At this time, the hurricane was intensifying very quickly. And here's our friend Hurricane Bill again. We don't know how the hurricane looked, but it was probably something like this, a very nicely organized hurricane with an eye. At that time, it seemed like the storm was going straight for Florida. And as you might imagine, Florida is very used to hurricanes, so they immediately made preparations for the storm. And just 3 years earlier, they have had the worst storm that has ever made landfall in the US, which is the Labor Day hurricane of 1935. So they took it very seriously, but the storm started to turn, what we call recurve, as it turned into the strongest it was, which was a category 5 near the Bahamas. So at some point, the observations from ships and from stations in the Bahamas told the forecasters that the storm was likely turning, like hurricanes do. And this is a little snippet from the New York Times from the previous day, the day before the hurricane. saying that there were thousands of relieved Florida residents taking down their barricades. And this is what they expected. Here's our friend Hurricane Bill again. They expected that the storm would recurve into the North Atlantic and it would only be a problem to transatlantic shipping lanes. So when the storm turned, it went into the Washington, D.C. jurisdiction. And this is how that office looked. This is an earlier picture from 1926, but it would have been similar. You had only men in their suits analyzing the weather. These were not the official forecasters. These were people that were doing map analysis and plotting so that the one forecaster in charge could put out a forecast. And they did not think, they didn't even consider the possibility that this storm would hit further north into New England. They were pretty sure it was going to turn, and there were not any warnings that were ever issued. And I could talk for an hour about the events at the Weather Bureau, but in the name of time, we move on. One thing they did say was that hurricanes avoid New England. And the reason they would say this is, first, because that's the normal path that the hurricanes take around the Bermuda High, but also because if a hurricane does cross northward into New England, it goes into colder waters. This red area here is the Gulf Stream, which is a warm water current that would provide energy for the hurricane. But after they cross that, the water is cold and hurricanes usually weaken. And even if they make it into New England, they're not a hurricane anymore. Another thing is that the last major hurricane to hit the region happened in 1869, which was the year before the agency that became the Weather Bureau and now the Weather Service formed. So even if you worked for the Weather Service for 70 years, you would have never seen a major hurricane hit New England. Some of you might have heard the name the Long Island Express, which is a common name for the storm. It's not my preferred name, but the reason for it is that it was moving forward very, very fast, way faster than a normal hurricane. And the reason was that there was this very strong jet stream that was very, very troughed, very, very bent southward that steered the storm straight northward. So the storm could not turn. Instead, it went straight to New England. So at landfall, the storm was not just very strong on its own right with the rotation, but also it was moving so fast that people experienced 120-mile-an-hour winds at landfall that afternoon over Long Island. Then it crossed Long Island and the Long Island Sound and made a second landfall into New Haven, Connecticut. The problem with this timing was that it was the worst possible case scenario, which was that it made landfall with the strength of a major hurricane. So it caused the very strong winds and the storm surge. At the same time, it was transitioning into what we call an extratropical storm, which tends to be weaker, but it was not weakening fast enough. So these extratropical storms are very, very, very large. So that's how you get a storm that is as strong as a major hurricane that covers the entire New England region. This image is from the National Geographic magazine, and I like it because it shows very nicely how it covered the entire region. Here's New Hampshire, here's Vermont, Maine, Massachusetts, etc. So that the hurricane and its winds and its rain covered everything. Many magazines, newspapers published issues, either entire issues about the hurricane or special articles right after the hurricane or on the anniversary of the storm. So when the storm came, people were in the streets, not knowing what was coming. Suddenly it started raining. It would have become windy. They would not have known what was happening. They would have only been able to react. So pictures of people with inside out umbrellas. This was in New York. Then the wind became so strong in the area of landfall that then it was obvious that something really bad was coming. The wind was roaring, roofs started to be damaged or taken away, all sorts of steeples get toppled. Then those that were near the water could see what looked like a fog in the distance, and it was the wall of water that was coming with the storm surge, about to flood the coast. So they were just reacting. They really didn't know what was happening until the damage and everything, until they were, some of them literally running for their lives. So these are pictures of steeples. If you go around the region, many churches have in their lobbies pictures of their steeples that have fallen, that were taken down by the hurricane. This book here, New England Hurricane, was a collection of photos and accounts, not witness accounts, but the Works Progress Administration, which was one of Roosevelt's New Deal agencies, had an army of writers and photographers that they sent out to document the storm. So there are lots of pictures and some really interesting descriptions about the damage, some of them quite poetic. So the damages depended on where you were. In the coastal region, it was the major hurricane damages like wind damage to structures. The storm surge did a lot of structural damage. It caused urban flooding. It damaged crops, livestock, and is also what caused the most fatalities. Most of the deaths were people that drowned in the storm surge. The largest amount was in Rhode Island. In interior New England, the biggest thing was a massive amount of tree damage. There was a lot of river flooding and lake flooding and landslides, blocked roads, and everywhere you had hundreds, probably thousands of roads and bridges and dams and railroads that had been washed out. You had downed power lines and telephone lines, and the shade trees in most downtowns were completely gone. This is a picture from Napatri Point, Rhode Island. It shows all sorts of these buildings by the water side. This is exactly the same place. You can see this structure here is also in the other picture. And this one is at lower tide, but you can see there's nothing else. And I found lots of accounts talking about the hurricane bringing the beaches back to their pristine state. Although that's not really true because all the damage, all the debris would have been back here. This is in Providence, which in places had up to 25 feet of water in. I have read accounts of the horns in the car shorting and going off. So you can imagine the deafening horns together with this is after the storm, so it had calmed down, but it would have been the wind and the waves and a horrendous experience. This is in Canal Street by the side of a building that used to be a market building in the 1700s, and now it's owned by the Rhode Island School of Design. They have marked the water line for the 1815 storm, and immediately they put a makeshift mark 2 feet higher where the water came for the 1938 hurricane. And my husband and I, a few years ago, we went to Rhode Island for a wedding, and we hunted it down. We didn't know exactly where it was at first, but we did find the plaque that was put in there on top of the previous one. The city of Providence, though, built a hurricane barrier, the Fox Point Hurricane Barrier in the 1960s, to avoid this happening again, but there hasn't been a major hurricane landfall in the area since, so they haven't had a chance to test it out yet. The storm pretty much destroyed the Sandbar Islands, where so many rich people's houses are. It caused a lot of breaks, including the one that's called the Shinnecock Inlet, that has actually been kept open to allow ships to go from the ocean to the Bay Area. And the waves, 20, 30 feet waves above the storm surge. This is in the southern tip of Manhattan, the Battery Park area. And this was not even the worst part of the worst side of the storm, which was a lot worse on the other side to the east of the eye. The water was so strong that it literally shook the ground. And we're talking about the storm surge, the wall of water that came in. So this is a seismograph in New York City, and it was detected all the way to Alaska. And in fact, one of the old books about the storm is called A Wind to Shake the World, referring to that shaking of the seismographs. So there have been a lot of books out there, a few books, that use witness accounts, similar to the one that Anna read to us at the beginning, and others, very dramatic ones. So that's how they put together the story in these books. What I did was not put together the witness accounts, but I used them for me to understand what was happening and what was felt and what the actual weather meant to those that were living through it. So the storm came into interior New England later that evening, and that's when Vermont, New Hampshire, western part of Maine, and southern Canada experienced it. If you go around the state to any historical society or local library, usually there's a book about their history, and every single one of them has a little bit or a lot about this storm. This is from Plymouth. The Plymouth Historical Society has this book about 200 years of Plymouth. And I want to read you a tiny little bit of this account. When morning dawned, the havoc was too astonishing. The earth was so soaked that century-old elms and maples fell, like this ones in the common or near the common of the downtown Plymouth. The forests were a tangle of broken, uprooted, and topless logs. Salvage was almost hopeless because the wood was filled with the coarse sand that dulls the sauce in the mills. While this seemed unbelievable, a salt spray covered everything, mingled with finely ground leaves that dried to a crust that demanded scrubbing to remove from the walls. So, we are 100 miles from the ocean, and we're talking about salt covering the walls, and not only that, but a crust of green mushed leaves covering everything. The trees were the biggest story in northern New England. What happened is that the ground was so soaked from it being so wet in the previous days and the previous summer that when that wind came, the trees just couldn't hold on and just were toppled or broken. There were 15 million acres of forest damaged, and the Forest Service estimated 5 billion board feet of timber of damage, and a board foot is 12 by 12 by 1. So they were thinking in terms of lumber. And the whole thing was followed by a massive salvage operation. This is a tangle of trees. This is in Keene, which was affected quite a bit. The Forest Service did a survey of damage. This is an excerpt of that. And you can see that the entire state of New Hampshire had tree damage, parts of Maine, large portion of Vermont, and going down into southern New England. You might think this area here didn't have any damage, but what happened, if I put a map of, topographical map of New Hampshire, is that this is where the White Mountain National Forest is, and they were not allowed to salvage trees in there. So they didn't even bother establishing how much tree damage there was in that area. So if you look outside, if you're in New Hampshire and you look outside, there's trees everywhere, right? So you can imagine all those trees down, most of them down. And that was shocking to people. And a lot of the things I found speak of the trees. How I found a magazine little snippet that said, our foliage friends are broken. No, what is it? Are down, and our hearts are broken. This is a poem by a third grader. It says, the winds did blow, the trees bent low, the leaves flew away from the wind's rough play. There were songs written about how the wind was so bold that the earth, the trees just could not hold. And this was in a scrapbook of children's work in a school district in Connecticut. I'll show it to you in a moment. And then I saw all sorts of accounts of children and young people going out, the children using the trees as jungle gyms, and the young ones going to the forest to explore. And recently, an audience member from one of these talks sent me these pictures showing just that. Many of the trees, there were so many trees that many of them were put into lakes to save them, especially the softwoods. And some ponds in the area, once in a while, the logs will just come up. And you know they are from the hurricane because they have a stamp from the Forest Service. And so again, this was an audience member that sent it to me after I told them the story. One of the places that they put the most trees was in Turkey Pond in Concord. Some of you that have gone to the Flume might have seen this bridge, the Sentinel Pine Bridge. This log here under it was a 100-foot tall, 5 feet in diameter tree that was knocked down by the storm. And the bridge itself was built with wood from fallen trees. This picture on the right actually was just sent to me by one of my friends who was hiking in the Flume this past weekend. So this is how it looks in the snow. So there was a 500-page book put together by the U.S. Geological Survey with flood information, river height information. So I used it with some of my students to study the river flow for the Connecticut River. This, however, is the Pemmy River in Plymouth, and I marked when the storm started and when it ended. And you can see that when the storm came, the river was already at flood stage. And I went to check out that site. It's has been there since 1903. So this picture is from about 10 years ago. I went with my kids, and you can see one of them was ready to pose for me while the other one was not so sure. So Chris is now in college, and I don't know if he would be mortified of me using this. But the bottom of this is at 17 feet above the bottom of the river. And the water went all the way to 23.6 feet. so it would have been several feet above Chris's head. There are some businesses in the floodplain of the Pemi River. Those of you that had gotten gas near exit 25, you might have seen this Citgo station that has some marks on its wall. And they have marked the water height for every storm when this gas station has existed. The highest one was in 1987. And the hurricane of 38, the station was not there for 38, but it would have been about a brick above that. And there's me posing right after Hurricane Irene, failing totally because I thought I was pointing at Irene, which is up here by my head, but I was pointing higher. The storm dissipated the next day over Canada. It was not moving as much anymore. It was just spinning and sputtering in place. New Hampshire had 12 deaths from the storm and millions in damages. The notches were closed, although they closed and then they opened and then they closed again. They were afraid of fires, and there were in fact many, many fires that people were putting out all the time. The hiking trails were blocked, but many tried to venture just for curiosity. But in general, people were just heartbroken about the landscape being gone. I was able to examine the written records of the Mount Washington Observatory. And these are the observer notes for the day after, the morning after the storm. And it speaks of violent winds that continued overnight. It speaks of blown down trees all around the mountain. It speaks of the carriage road, which is the outer road, being blocked by fallen trees. It talks about the railroad trestle being ripped. And this is the Cog Railway. And just recently, I finally had a chance to take the ride on the Cog Railway. And when he's talking about the tree line, he's talking about up here by the mountain. There's a very, very steep area called the Jacob's Ladder, which is actually this picture here. And that part was destroyed. So when I had my ride, I was able to see, I was just, listening to the tour guide. And suddenly he says that that wood on the side was from the 1938 hurricane. They didn't clean up, they rebuilt, but they just left the wood right there. So there I was jumping off my seat, trying to take pictures of this wood fallen from the 1938 hurricane that is just sitting there. So what was left behind was just an unimaginable devastation, like you or I cannot even imagine. There was a massive relief effort that followed the storm. All agencies put out reports, the Red Cross, the New Hampshire Emergency Management, the Geological Survey, news organizations, newspapers, so a lot of sources of information, technical information, but also lots of scrapbooks, lots of letters, and lots of tidbits of reports everywhere. One thing to keep in mind is that when it happened, of course, it devastated New England, but the rest of the country was not really as fully aware of it because we were paying attention to what was happening in Europe. And you got the New York Times headline the next day, the hurricane and the political situation shared the headline, even though New York Times would have been a local newspaper for the area affected. Another thing that we don't think about is the fact that this was just a couple of weeks before the beautiful fall colors were due to come, and instead most trees were bare, also making it very sad. So there's a lot more, and I am going to show you a little bit of that because we're already kind of running out of time here. But for example, I found these discs that the city of Hartford put together. They put a brass plate on it that said Hurricane Relief Relic and the date. And I've been buying all the ones I can buy on eBay. And one day I got this one that was in excellent shape. It came in a box, and I was looking at the box and I noticed this post nubila Phoebus, which is Latin, which means after the clouds come the sun. Phoebus was a god of the sun. So that seems extremely appropriate for a hurricane. After the clouds come the sun. And then I started trying to figure out if this was purposeful for the storm or not. And after digging around and talking to friends and reading books, I figured out that this was the seal of the city of Hartford. I read the story of how that seal was developed, and it was way before the hurricane, so this was potentially a very excellent coincidence. I also found all sorts of other places where the phrase was used, like, for example, $55 notes during colonial times. So I wrote it all in the website, the takenbystorm1938.com. I wrote the story of some of the items that I have found and how I figured out where they came from. So you are welcome to go to the supplements area and find a few stories of my adventures figuring things out. I also found on eBay this excellent scrapbook put together by the Connecticut School District that I mentioned before. It's 80 pages and it's filled with poems and songs and drawings. And one of these days I'm going to do some kind of study, a deeper study of it. But most of the items I found talk about the trees. So let's see, stories about the storm, stories, fictional stories that use the storm in one way or another. All sorts of art, photography, drawings, paintings, lots of infographic type of art, if you will, out there. Phone companies, power companies, they all had some kind of visualization. This wonderful map is hand-drawn, and I found it at the National Archives. And it was folded inside an envelope, and it seemed like it accompanied a report, and it had probably not been opened for 75 years. So I was really excited when I found it. It's very large, about 2 by 3. Different types of scientific visualizations. Here's the full map of the tree damage from the Forest Service. All sorts of postcards with damage from the storm. Picture collections everywhere. Every city, every town published its picture collections. I found some photos in color that are very rare as well. And then many of the reports and the picture collections also had art that was created especially for the hurricane. Most of the time not attributed to the artist that put it together, but it represents a lot of the types of things that people would have experienced over the ocean or seen in their towns. The people working to clear the damage, the families standing in front of the devastation of their homes, and just visualizations of the death that came with the storm. I found this piece of roof, says slate from someone's roof blown onto car during hurricane, 10 hours. So, and it has the date 1938, September 21, 1938. I found little pins carved with wood from the hurricane, wood fallen from the hurricane. At some point, people started bringing me chairs to these talks to show me that they were made with wood from the hurricane. And I did some digging and figured out the company, some chair company in Massachusetts that had been working since colonial times. And I found myself one of them. It's a little kitty rocking chair. And you can read my story with the chairs also in the website. I do not have any of these bowls. It probably would be very hard to know if a bowl is from the storm or not, but they didn't only make furniture, they also made bowls. So I imagine a lot of companies got their hands onto the wood from these storms. So you might wonder, can this happen again? And yes, of course it can happen again. Hopefully anytime soon. And you and I will be dead for a long time before it happens again. The good news is that our forecasting is better, so it will not catch us by surprise. We have good emergency management practices in order. Some of them put in place thanks to this hurricane. The bad news is that we have more trees, more infrastructure, more expensive construction on the coast. So it will likely be way more expensive, but a lot less deadly. And as climate changes and the sea level rises, even if a storm came that was of the same strength or maybe even weaker, the effects could be even worse just because the water can make it further inland. So there's so much more that could be said about this storm. I like to joke that I could talk for 10 hours and obviously not gonna do that. And I normally end reading the end of the book, but instead I'm just going to stop my share and open it to questions. And I'm going to go into gallery mode so I can see you.
Thank you, Lourdes. I'm just jumping in because I believe someone raised their hand, but I don't think, unfortunately, that we're set up to let those folks answer the question through video. We might need to use the chat. Okay. I think I can do this actually. Cricket, Sewells, if you are still interested in asking a question, I see your hand is raised, so I'm gonna allow you to unmute yourself. And if that does not work, then we will go to the text chat. Okay, I think we're gonna, I think it'll be easiest for everybody, if you guys don't mind, if we can stick to putting the questions in the Q&A and the chat. Thank you for raising your hand, very polite. And yes, we'll start with I'll read some out to you, or do you have them, Lourdes?
Okay, I can see the Q&A and the chat.
If you don't mind, I'll just go ahead and read them out so you don't have to balance.
That'll be easier.
Okay, so let's start. Gail McPeak, asks, given the strength of the storm and the timing, she's surprised that there weren't more deaths. Are you?
Well, that's a good question. I think the 700 deaths was a large number. It is likely because a lot of the people that would have been there just a week or two before were not there anymore. A lot of the people that, a lot of these towns get twice or 3 times or 5 times their population during the summer. And the fact that a lot of them had gone back home actually made a big difference in the deaths. So likely that was why there were not as many. But there were many, of course. Yeah. The lowest barometric pressure. I have to take a quick look. So why don't you ask me another one of the questions while I take.
Okay, while you look up the pressure.
Yeah.
Charles Perkins asks, would today's weather computers have predicted the incredible acceleration of the 38 storm into New England?
I think the computer models would probably catch it. We have a lot of computer models, of course, and there's usually some variability in their predictions until a couple of days before the storm when they all kind of get in line. So I have a feeling that if you saw a really, really fast forward motion very early in the forecast period, you would probably pay attention to it, but you wouldn't believe it until you saw other signs. So I think that it would predict it. Now, another difference is that back then, warnings were not put out until the storm was already making landfall. These days, warnings go out a day and a half before. So when you think the storm is going to make landfall within a day and a half. So it would have been a lot more time for people to get out of the way than they would have had back then, even if they saw it coming. So the pressure, I have it in millibars. Let's see. Oh, I lost it. So when it was first observed, it was 958 millibars, and I don't have it here, but it would have been in inches of mercury of the order of 27 inches of mercury or so. Yeah, sorry, I don't have that information right at my fingertips.
That's okay, Lourdes. There's lots of other questions that you're going to answer for our people, so don't worry. We have Patricia asked, what was the sea surface temperatures along the storm path?
So we don't have actual observations, but the sea surface temperature along the Gulf Stream when the storm was near its strongest would have probably been in the 70s, probably up to 80 degrees, and very quickly gone down into the 50s. Now that would totally kill a hurricane, but the storm was moving so fast that as it was weakening because of the lesser sea surface temperature, it was moving, through the area and causing its damage. Plus, it was also, as these types of storms that transition do, it was also gaining energy from the jet stream at that time.
And we have another question that I think relates. Colin asks, did the distribution of ocean temperatures south to north change during the 38 hurricane? He says, I thought the colder temps along northeast coast would not help the hurricane.
Right.
So you kind of answered that.
So if the water would have been too cold to sustain it. And normally when these storms do make it, they're very weak and they're more like a nor'easter than a strong hurricane. But the storm was moving so fast that there was not enough time for it to weaken enough. I see there's a question there about how do we know what the jet stream looked like. So basically the path and the strength of the storm tells us what the steering winds would have been. So normally when we learn what the steering winds will be of the jet stream, we know where the storm is going to go. We didn't have upper air observations in 1938 over the Northeast US. So basically we have reconstructed what the upper level winds that steered the hurricane would have to be in order for the storm to do what it did.
And I'm going to back up in the chat a little bit to catch some that we missed, some questions. Artis asks, were there permanent changes to the Long Island coast?
Yes, especially in the sandbars. There were many breaks. So those sandbars are very dynamic, that are constantly changing with the water's strength. But when a storm like this one comes, they are decimated and then they refill again, and some areas refill, others don't. Some areas that were connected became more like islands, and some areas got their topsoil taken away, so they were bare. So definitely lots of geological changes to the coast. Some of them irreversible and some of them reversible.
Okay, do we have any more questions? Yes.
One of the little discs that I like.
That's awesome.
I know this is the first time ever that I can show one of these from my office because I'm normally at the location rather than in my office.
Carolyn Reno has asked, was there flooding similar to Irene?
Yes, definitely. The flooding, the river flooding was very similar to Irene. Some areas might have had worse flooding during Irene, but it would have been a more localized area. So what you can think of is what happened during Irene, but not just in one specific portion of Vermont and New Hampshire, everywhere. So yes, definitely.
Okay. Any more questions for Lourdes? If not, I'm gonna announce who won a book. We do have another question. Nancy asked, will the program be available to view online? We do plan to do that, Nancy. I think if you're logged in now, then we have your email address, so we will be able to share that with you. I don't have an immediate timeline for you, but we do plan to have that available for you later. And another question here for you, Lourdes. Without the dip south of the jet stream, would the 78 event not have been severe at all?
You mean 38?
Yes, I most definitely did.
So yes, in order for such a strong hurricane to come exactly in the way that the storm came, you need that really big dip, and it's more about the direction that will turn the storm into. If the dip is wider, then the storm can be turned away a little easier. If the dip is very straight down, then the storm goes straight north. And the deeper that, the stronger the wind is in that dip, then the faster the storm goes. So yes, it has 100% to do with what that dip in the jet stream did.
Right, good question, Colin. Carolyn also asked, did any rivers change course?
Oh, yes, I have seen at least one report of a river that went in a different direction after the storm, and I don't think it went back. Normally, no. It would have to be just so that the terrain was changed in a way that the water had to change its course. I don't have the information about the specific river. There is one specific river that I have read about that did this in New Hampshire, but that was not the normal thing. What happened was that there was a lot more erosion of the river sides, which caused a lot more tree damage as well.
Okay, I have a question personally, if you don't mind.
No.
I grew up in the South, and obviously there's a hurricane season, lots of evacuations in my childhood and decisions of whether or not to evacuate. So I understand that in 1938, there wasn't the forewarning to make those decisions based on. So the devastation was, in addition to being devastating, they didn't have a chance to fight back or batten down the hatches, I guess. I experienced growing up in my childhood, there's a strong cultural push to weather out the storm. It's sort of a point of pride that you do not evacuate, that you take care of your house and you go in the basement or whatever your situation is. In the anecdotal stories that you come across, do you see any of that kind of attitude at that point in time of like, oh, I survived this in this way? Or is it more just, wow, what a storm?
So first of all, as you said, they didn't know, right? So they didn't have a chance to have that attitude of I'm not leaving my home. They also did not understand that hurricanes can affect New England. They thought that was something that happens far away, down in Florida. what I did see was a lot of pride about, you know, the Yankee strength, you know, and self resilience. And so I saw a lot of that, including like old ladies that didn't want the young guys in the neighborhood to fix her stuff because she could fix it herself. So I did see a lot of that, and it was also in a lot of reports written in poetic form, that, you know, New Englanders can survive this and handle this. So that I saw.
All right, well, that's my question. Any final questions from anybody in the audience? I think we may have come to the end. I'll interrupt if not. Let me just pull up our book winner here. Pardon me. Okay, so, well, first of all, thank you to Lourdes and all of our attendees. This is the second in a 4-part series, weather history lectures. I feel like this one is already my favorite. Really interesting stuff here. If you're interested in learning more about these upcoming weather programs, you can visit our website. You can follow us on social media. Okay, the important thing. Tonight's a winner of Dr. Aviles' book, Taken by Storm, 1938, A Social and Meteorological History of the Great New England Hurricane, is Babs Ben from Portsmouth, New Hampshire. So congratulations, Babs, and we will connect with you over email about getting that book to you.
So it was my pleasure, and thank you so much for inviting me. And if anybody has any interesting pictures or tidbits about the storm, send them my way.
We will share, absolutely. We have a lot of thank yous in the chat. So I just want to echo that. Thank you to everybody. Thank you for the fascinating presentation. Thank you to New Hampshire Humanities for their support to allow this programming to you free of charge. When you exit the screen, you will be directed to a short anonymous survey, which we would appreciate so much if you could take a second to fill that out so that we can continue to bring you stimulating, engaging programming. And we hope to see you at our next Weatherwise lecture, which is Thursday, April 8th, for Exhibiting Nature's Nation, the Changing Climate of Art History. And I think that is it for the night. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Lourdes, and have a good night.
Night.